Imagine you're born into a world that makes sense. The forests near your camp are thick and full of food. The rivers run reliably. Your parents taught you where the herds move each season, which plants come up after the rains, how to read this land because your grandparents taught them, and their grandparents taught them. This is just what the world is. It has always been this way. It will always be this way. And then, within your own lifetime, without warning, it isn't. Around 1900 years ago, something happened to the climate of the entire planet that most people alive today have never even heard of. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas. And if you were a hunter-gatherer living through it, it wouldn't have felt like a bad winter. It would have felt like the world breaking. Here's what we know for certain. The Earth had been slowly warming out of the last ice age. Glaciers were retreating. Forests were spreading back into lands that had been frozen tundra for tens of thousands of years. And then, over what may have been as little as a single decade, the warming didn't just stop, it reversed. Temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere plunged back down toward full Ice Age conditions, and they stayed that way. Not for a season, not for a few bad years. For roughly 1,200 years. For roughly 1,200 years. Think about that number for a second. 1,200 years is longer than the entire history of most nations on Earth today. Nobody who was alive when the cold began was still alive when it ended. Generations were born, lived their whole lives, and died inside a climate crisis that simply never lifted. So what caused it? The leading explanation involves water, of all things. As the Ice Age glaciers melted, an enormous lake of fresh meltwater built up across North America, held back by walls of ice. At some point, scientists believe that ice dam failed, and a colossal pulse of fresh water surged into the North Atlantic Ocean. That matters because the ocean has a kind of engine, a system of currents that carries warm water north and keeps places like Europe far milder than their latitude should allow. Dump enough fresh water into the wrong part of that system, and you can stall the engine. Cut off the heat transport, and the whole Northern Hemisphere cools rapidly. But there's a second theory, and I want to be straightforward with you about how contested it is. Starting in 2007, a group of researchers proposed something far more dramatic, that the Younger Dryas wasn't triggered by meltwater alone, but by a comet or asteroid impact, or possibly an airburst explosion in the atmosphere. Their evidence includes a strange layer found at dozens of sites across the globe, all dating to the exact same moment, containing things like microscopic diamonds, tiny magnetic spherules, and unusually high concentrations of platinum, an element far more common in space rocks than in 300 Freen, the Earth's own crust. Some researchers have also pointed to evidence of continent-scale wildfires right around this time, with newer studies estimating that something like 10% of the planet's biomass may have burned. It's a genuinely dramatic hypothesis, and it has genuinely serious critics. A major review, running to nearly 300 pages, has argued that the impact evidence doesn't hold up, and that the platinum, the spirals, and the fire evidence can likely be explained without invoking a comet at all. This is still an active, unresolved argument inside the scientific community. So the honest answer is this. We know the cold happened. We know it happened fast. We know it happened fast. We do not fully agree on what triggered it. What we don't have to guess about is what happened to the world once that cold set in. The Younger Dryas coincides with the final disappearance of some of the most iconic animals in Ice Age history. Woolly mammoths in Eurasia, American mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths. Some of these species had already been under pressure from human hunting for thousands of years. But the sudden, radical shift in their habitat and their food supply, all happening within a human lifetime instead of over centuries, appears to have been the decisive blow. When your food source disappears in the span of a decade instead of a millennium, there's no time to adapt. There's just collapse. So if it was a crisis severe enough to end the reign of giant Ice Age mammals, what did it do to us? Here's where the story gets genuinely surprising. You'd expect the archaeological record to show catastrophe, mass die-offs, abandoned settlements everywhere. And in some places, that's exactly what you find. But in others, you find almost nothing at all. In central and southern Portugal, archaeologists studying sites from this exact window have found something unexpected. The vegetation clearly changed. The pollen record shows it. But the human archaeological record shows barely any disruption to how people were actually living. The tools stay consistent. The sites stay occupied. Researchers studying the region have concluded that the flexible, adaptable technology and economy of the people living there simply absorbed the shock. The climate changed around them and they kept going. But travel north to what's now Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern Germany, and the story looks different. This region was home to a culture archaeologists call the Ahrensbergian, identified by their distinctive tanged stone points. These were people who had only recently pushed north into territory freed up by the retreating glaciers, following reindeer herds into a newly warming world. And then the Younger Dryas arrived, and that world reversed underneath them. Researchers describe the climate event as having had a considerable, if variable, impact on hunter-gatherer societies across this entire region. Some areas show clear breaks in occupation. Others show populations adapting their hunting patterns and settlement locations to survive in what had suddenly become frigid steppe land again. And then there's the region where this crisis may have changed the entire future of our species, the Fertile Crescent, in what's now the Levant. Before the Younger Dryas, communities in this region were living in a relatively forested, food-rich landscape, gathering wild grains and hunting game across a diverse environment. Then, the climate flipped. Conditions turned drier and cooler. And according to researchers studying this transition, people could no longer sustain themselves purely as hunter-gatherers the way they always had. The forests thinned. The diverse food web that generations had relied on started disappearing at a site called Kurtik Tepe in what's now southeastern Turkey. Archaeobotanists have found something remarkable buried in the layers from this exact period. As the oak woodlands opened up under the new, harsher climate, they were replaced by expanding grasslands full of small-seeded wild grasses. And the people living there didn't just endure this change, they exploited it. The archaeological record shows increasing use of these wild cereal ancestors, the wild relatives of the wheat and barley that would eventually feed entire civilizations. Some researchers now argue that the environmental pressure of the Younger Dryas was one of the forces that pushed hunter-gatherer communities in this region toward the earliest steps of deliberate cultivation. Not because farming was a brilliant new idea someone had on a good day, but because the old way of living was disappearing under their feet and the wild grasses were what was left. If that's right, then one of the most important transitions in human history, the invention of agriculture itself, the thing that would eventually lead to cities, writing, and everything we call civilization, may have been born out of exactly the same kind of forced crisis you'd expect to. Just destroy people. Not comfort, not abundance, scarcity, and 1,200 years of a climate that refused to go back to normal. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in all of this. When researchers look across the archaeological record of the Younger Dryas as a whole, what they find isn't a story of collapse. There's no evidence of a generalized population disaster, no widespread disappearance of human groups across the board. What they find instead is described, in the researchers' own words, as a remarkable capacity for adaptation and resilience, one that led directly to some of the most decisive cultural innovations in all of prehistory. Some communities barely noticed the shift and carried on almost unchanged. Others were pushed to the edge of what their way of life could survive and adapted their hunting grounds, their settlements, their entire relationship with the land around them. And at least one group, faced with a vanishing world, planted the first deliberate seeds of the world we live in now. 1,200 years is an almost unimaginable stretch of time to live inside a crisis. Long enough that nobody remembered what came before it. Long enough that, for the people living through the middle of it, this simply was the world, cold and difficult and permanent. And then, around 11,700 years ago, it ended, almost as abruptly as it began. The climate warmed again, this time for good. The world our entire civilization was built in, the stable, relatively mild climate we've enjoyed for the last 11,000 years, is itself just the calm that came after this storm. So the next time you hear someone talk about the birth of agriculture or the end of the Ice Age as some kind of clean, inevitable turning point in the human story, remember what was actually happening on the ground. Somewhere in the cold, dying forests of the ancient Near East, people watched the world they knew disappear, adapted to grasses growing where trees used to stand, and without knowing it, began building everything that came after.